Detaching from Unhelpful Thoughts. I'm very greatly indebted to Russ Harris's work. So he's been a very pivotal person in the ACT therapy movement. And I really love his books, ACT Made Simple and The Happiness Trap. So I really, especially the second one, is really meant for lay people to read The Happiness Trap. Definitely look for this, because this is where you're going to find this kind of concepts, and this is how you could practice what you've learned here further. Definitely check out The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. Okay, so the first thing here, this is actually a picture of Andy Warhol. So, the artist Andy Warhol. He has his hands in front of his face. I think it's Andy Warhol anyway. But anyway, so I would like everyone to hold your hand in front of your face like this. I know I used to do these workshops in person. I could actually see people hold their hands in front of their faces, but you could see me hold my hand in front of my face, just like Andy Warhol here. So my question for you is, like, when you're holding your hand in front of your face like this, how would it be like to have your hands covering your eyes this way? How would it be limiting to you, and what would you miss out on if you have your hands over your eyes like that?
Well, you'd miss out on a lot, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also you'd have to rely upon your other senses because you're not using your eyes.
Exactly. So, like, our ability for sight is very limited here with our hands in front of our eyes. We have to use other modalities. Blade Runner.
Yeah, I mean, you experience so much of life through your eyes. You'd miss out on the experience of just something was like colors. You wouldn't know what colors are like. You wouldn't know what like nature is. And
right.
Meeting somebody else and seeing someone else, what they look like, and that's a lot. And plus, like, communication is mostly nonverbal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you can rely on sound, but that's only half the picture when it comes to communication as well.
Yes. So the whole entire brilliance of life, people are going to miss out on if the hands are in front of the face like that. Absolutely. And also, like, this sense of human connection as well. So now you have your hand in front of your face. Now move your hand away from your face and kind of notice the difference. So, like, when you have your hands in front of your face, sometimes you could kind of peep through your fingers and kind of see what's going on in front of you. And now you move your hand out away, you could see a lot more. Your hand is not gone. Your hand is still within your vision. So you probably are wondering, so I came here to learn about detaching from unhelpful thoughts, and Leon's telling me about hands and moving them away. So what is this all about? So what this is all about is that the hand represents your thoughts. So our thoughts, when we are fused with our thoughts, that's when our hands are close to our face like this. That means when that happens, it's hard to see what is really going on in our lives. It's hard to engage in life, right? So, like what Blade Runner says, like, the whole brilliance of life out there, you'll be missing out on, like human connection as well, you'll be missing out on. And then we miss out on what's happening in life, and it also prevents us from acting effectively. Like, how are we going to go about our lives so much if you have your hands this over your face like this, right? You can't, just like Karen was saying, you can't rely on your vision so much. So our thoughts are the same thing. And also feelings too. We fuse with our thoughts and feelings. A lot of unhelpful thoughts kind of show up like this. There's a reason why I use the word unhelpful, because when we look at things as positive and negative, that's kind of like really not a helpful way to pass judgment. So I like to tell my clients this: it's always much more helpful, usually much more helpful, to look at things in terms of helpful and versus unhelpful, because there's not as much value judgment attached to it. When we put value judgment to things, we start to feel more emotionally about it in such a way that it's not conducive to doing things well. So when we look at helpful, unhelpful, it's kind of takes that value judgment out and kind of helps us to look at things clearer in a way, look at things in terms of its effectiveness rather than what's right or wrong. So what we're going to be talking about here is how can you move your hand away? So what people do is that they want to try to get rid of their thoughts, but in many cases, you can't get rid of your thoughts. Sometimes you could dispute some of your thoughts, but often it's a case that there's a lot of thoughts that are kind of swimming around and they're bothersome, and we start to exacerbate the situation by horrifying ourselves about our thoughts and feelings. Like, why am I feeling this way? Why am I thinking this way? So we have that original negative thought, like, I don't like having social anxiety, right? So that may be the thought. And we have a second thought that goes like, oh, it's horrible that I have this thought about not liking my social anxiety. How dare I not have this thought? How dare I have this thought? So there's an extra layer of suffering that kind of goes on. So what I'm saying is not helpful to necessarily completely get rid of thoughts. It's more about viewing your thoughts at a distance. But
Leon,
yes.
I think that you cannot get rid of the thought, but you can replace with other thoughts.
It's
Like
true.
you don't want to,
Yes.
you don't want to think about something, so you think about something what you want to think.
Yeah, yes. And what I'm saying here is that often that works, right? There's reframing thoughts that helps. And what I like to say is like, there's these times when thoughts are very distracting to us. And then there's these times you may experience where you can't put away your thought. And then we start to feel very negatively about how we can't put away our thought. So this is about how you could get rid of that fusion with that thought, or like release that fusion and see that thought at a distance. So it's not, so the thought is there, but it's not as distracting to us as before. So yes, so Varsha has a really great point. It's not very black and white. It's not like you could only put your thoughts at a distance or you could only reframe your thoughts. Sometimes it's helpful to reframe. Sometimes it's helpful to distract yourself. Sometimes it's helpful to allow those thoughts to be there. Those are all good different strategies. Violet.
Yeah, I have a question because my issue a lot of times is not just concepts themselves, but remembering embarrassing, cringeworthy scenarios, and then anticipating the next time I'll see a person or like reenact another embarrassing, cringeworthy scenario to reflect upon. So can you replace all of this whole like PowerPoint, the idea of thoughts with scenarios, or is that a different concept?
Let me know if I understand correctly. So you're talking about feeling embarrassed about future situations, right? So when it comes to that, it's actually often helpful because usually embarrassment comes from anxiety. That when we have difficulties with anxiety, what's usually happening is that there's the situation itself that we feel embarrassed about, and then we have anxiety about feeling embarrassed. So that's like a secondary emotion. And actually, these kind of exercises from ACT therapy, which I'm presenting here, are useful for that, because often when we try to escape our anxiety or embarrassment, it kind of makes that anxiety and embarrassment stronger. So there's actually something that's not related with this therapy, but there's actually another therapy technique where you actually kind of allow that anxiety to be here. So that's called paradoxical intention. Like you actually even tell yourself, try to make yourself even more anxious, because the thing is, the reason why the anxiety shows up is that we fear the expectation of the event. So this event itself that causes us kind of a sense of embarrassment. And then we have anxiety about that situation. So that's like kind of like a double whammy, because we have expectations about like how we want to be in that situation. So a good way to take that expectation away is by actually actively accepting that anxiety to be there, because then that expectation goes away and then people tend to be less anxious. There's also different ways to work with it. So maybe that way does not work for you, but there's also other ways as well. Does that help answer your question, Violet?
Yes, I understand what you're saying.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? Questions?
Yeah, I have a question. The previous slide, I think you mentioned that there are several strategies. For instance, you can distract yourself or reframe the thoughts. How do you know which situation would be best for, which strategy would be best for the situation the person is dealing with? How do I know which situation to employ to help me overcome whatever issue I'm having?
Great. Yeah, and that's a good question. It's very individual. So like when I work with clients, I get to know them as an individual, and there's people who tend to do better with thought diffusion, which I'm talking about here. Some people do better with reframing, but usually people, it's helpful to have a mixture of both. And if one doesn't work, the other one helps. Usually what happens is that people first try to reframe their thoughts, and then maybe that works 70% of the time. But then 30% of the time it doesn't. Then that's when I talk about this strategy, about diffusion with thoughts. Another way I like to look at it is that sometimes it takes time for us to buy into a new way of looking at the world and things, and with a reframe, looking at the world differently. It takes some time, right? In the meantime, in order to kind of alleviate the stress around things, I practice diffusion exercises with the client so that they feel better in the meantime while they're working towards a new thought, a new way of looking at things. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So the next thing is talking about fusion with thoughts. So think about a newspaper story. A newspaper story provides a way for you to look into how the world is, right? But as you know, like there's different kinds of newspapers. There's newspapers that are left-leaning, centrist, and there's also right-leaning newspapers. And also the people who write the newspapers, they have their own personal opinion, right? So when you read a newspaper story, it's not simply facts. There's also a perspective on that story. So in the same way, we have stories in our mind that kind of run and they run, and we kind of mistake them as facts, but they're actually stories that are in our heads. And mixed with it, there's facts there, but mixed with the facts is interpretation of how things look like. So fusion happens when we see the absolute truth in our stories. That means we become stuck with our story. So when you're fused, when your hand is in front of your face like this, that means those thoughts that are kind of running in your head, you completely believe them, and you kind of get stuck with that story that they're telling you. Any questions about this? It's pretty straightforward, right?
I've got a comment that this is very much like, besides newspaper articles, it's actually how, even as a culture, we interpret history. We can't get away from it.
Exactly. Yeah. So even at a historical perspective, like there's always some sort of narrative thing that's being played, right? So we have narratives about our lives. So something in therapy, like what I do is changing the narrative of the client. That the client kind of, everyone's always telling their own story in some sort of way, right? And sometimes we may look at things through a dimmer lens, but there's a way to kind of flip that story around so that we could see it from another angle, something in a more helpful kind of angle for us. Okay, anybody else? Okay, I got these sticky keys. All right, here's another one. Achoo, sneezing. So if you notice, like when people sneeze, they close their eyes, right? So achoo, just like this lady right here. So automatic thoughts are like, shutting eyes when sneezing. So when you sneeze, you automatically shut your eyes. So people often tell me, like, when you go out, like if you have social anxiety, you go out to a social situation, you're going to naturally have these thoughts that show up around your social anxiety and about fearing people's judgments. So what people do is that they start to avoid social situations, because when they avoid social situations and they stay home, they don't have these thoughts. So the thing is, people run into problems because they try to avoid their thoughts. They think that having thoughts, unhelpful thoughts themselves, is a bad thing. It's a terrible thing. It's terrible to have bad thoughts. So I'm going to do everything to try to get away from those thoughts. The problem is that causes us to avoid engaging in life. So the thing is, what you want to do is that when you go to the social situation, for example, that you could expect that you're going to have anxious thoughts about it. Over time, those anxious thoughts could change when you start to adapt to the social situation. You might reframe things, look at things differently. But in the meantime, it's automatic. It's automatic that say that there's an potential future embarrassing situation. You're going to have thoughts run through your head. And what people do is they try to shut all those thoughts out. But when they try to shut all those thoughts out, they actually become more anxious, and they start to have negative thoughts about having negative thoughts. Like, why am I having all these negative thoughts right now? I should think better about myself. And what that causes people to do is they start to avoid the situation. So here, this is something I love about ACT therapy, is destigmatizing thoughts and saying, you want to live your life differently. You want to live the life that you value. Go out into the world, you socialize, and you're going to expect these anxious thoughts, and they're almost like a sneeze. So when you sneeze, you're gonna blink. Just like when you go to the social situation, you're gonna have those anxious thoughts. But that's not in itself a terrible thing. It's not terrible to have those thoughts. There's a way to work with those thoughts, way to be with those thoughts while still engaging with what you want out of your life, right? So you're not going to try to sneeze and try to keep your eyes open. It's kind of funny. It doesn't work that way. Any questions about that?
Let's pull
Yes,
that. What if the thoughts are about something really profound? I happen to be mourning somebody that died, who was very close to me. And of course, it's very painful to think about them. And I would rather avoid thinking. And a lot of times it comes up before I'm going to sleep at night.
Yeah.
So, to just sort of let the thought. So it's a natural thing to want to avoid the thoughts, even though I understand what you're saying. I think it's a little different than social anxiety, but what do you do in a situation like that? Because you want to avoid. I mean, sometimes I feel it's actually good that I'm avoiding the thought. Otherwise, I might be up all night crying or something.
Of course. Yeah, and I really appreciate your intuition about it, because I think you're listening to yourself and what you need there, right? And it's really tough to go through something like this through a mourning process. So I don't want to belittle it in any ways. Here, I think you're smart about it because you're using different strategies. So sometimes it's helpful to distract ourselves, like when we're having a difficult time, it's helpful to distract ourselves. It's helpful to think about something else. It's also helpful to, over time, to reframe our thoughts too. So the thing's, mourning is a process. It's not like you're gonna you can't just simply flip what thoughts that you have into positive thoughts, because that's actually very superficial. It's superficial. It's not really true either, because that doesn't really carry how the human experience of mourning is like. It's a process. It's a process that takes time, and but over time we start to build some sort of perspective around mourning. It's not like simply a happy, positive perspective, but like something that's a meaningful perspective around it. And then that over time makes us feel better. And in the meantime, it may also be helpful to have thought diffusion, because sometimes we try to distract ourselves from our thoughts or trying to look away. It's helpful, or try to reframe our thoughts. It's helpful, but other times we can't help but think those thoughts. Right. So this is what happens when you can't help but think these kind of thoughts. Sometimes it's kind of too tiring to push thoughts away. So like, how can we let the thoughts be there, right? So that's how. So thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a very meaningful example, like a meaningful thing to bring up here too, so that it helps everyone in this call kind of put this into perspective. I think ACT therapy is like one method, a very effective one method to work with thoughts.
Excuse me.
Yes.
One of the ideas was to say a word over and over and over again, which seemed like something to desensitize one to some degree. Same thing. I'm getting the same idea with destigmatize, that, for instance, whether it's mourning or judging a thought being bad, it's like if you just somehow desensitize yourself to the fact that, like you're going to blink when you sneeze.
Yes.
You can't really judge that if you accept it as a natural thing that's just going to happen. You can't say it's good or bad. It's just going to happen. Sometime I've been through many mourning processes. They've all been different, but I've come around to accept it. Like, okay, like I can't change death. Death is going to happen to me. It's going to happen to everything. There's no way to avoid it, at least in my belief. So in a way, I'm getting, I don't want to say that I've been hardened to it, but I am slightly more desensitized, because I know it's going to happen and I know it's going to hurt to some degree. So it's like, okay, it's going to happen again. Okay.
Yes.
I'm not going to say it's a bad thing. It's a natural thing. So when you get to these destigmatize the thoughts and saying, okay, it's going to happen. The anxiety is going to happen if I go out and I'm anxious about going out. So then what? I can't answer that.
First of all, I want to, I really appreciate how much perspective you brought into this. So this is something you're speaking from your own experience, right? And then I think it's very helpful for people to hear that it is possible to, I guess it's hard to put words to. It's not really so much like get used to it, like, or simply desensitize. It's like we have put it into perspective in some sort of way, right? And it doesn't mean that it's not going to be a hard or difficult experience, but we put into perspective. And as you said, like, it's with that desensitization, it's easier to kind of engage in life more. Can you repeat back the question? Yeah, the question at the end. Can you repeat it back, Karen? You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay. The big question that I'm trying to get to is that I get a huge picture, and I'm dealing with artists that are painting universes and galaxies besides. And then there's this thing happening in between Israel and Palestine.
Yes.
Where I still see galaxies eating up other galaxies, black holes devouring and spaghettifying inwards coming stars and things like that.
Yes.
And I see the Israeli nation against the Palestinians, and then when the Palestinians get strong enough, then they're against the Israelis. And it's like this flip-flop thing never seems to stop. It seems to be natural no matter where we are in the whole universe.
Yes.
So it's like I'm struggling with just this human perspective and trying to be less anxious about it. I'm trying to be not to stigmatize it. I'm trying to get another perspective. I find that it's a huge, huge task.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to apply the ACT to it and other methods. And it's really hard.
Yes.
So the whole question is what was that? So the whole question is, how can we all help each other? Where are we headed?
Okay.
It's a very big, anxious question.
Yeah. That is a big question. And again, I think one thing I could really appreciate is that you are kind of taking a holistic view of the whole entire world. And though like questions of mental health often are personal questions, they're also like universal human questions too. Like we have conflicts within ourselves, and there's also conflicts between nations and people too. And it's a lot to take in. It's really tough to work with, but like it is all part of a process. So I see what you're doing is like you're bringing in these different therapy techniques and also things outside of therapy to kind of make sense out of things and try to be both like objective and also not overly sensitized, at the same time being sensitive too. And I think this is a delicate human task. This is actually what it means to be human. This is what human growth is about, right? That we're working in different aspects of ourselves that basically combining the opposites. Like there's two sides, being sensitive and also being objective, right? And then bring those two together. So sometimes we get too extreme in both directions, right? And you're talking about this whole balancing process and something that's cultivated over time. And and this is what human transformation is about. So knowing that it's a process brings less overwhelm to it. And I think that you've done some great work, because it's just hearing what you say, you could really put things into perspective. So, and also to remember to take things a step at a time. Like even like when we work on one thing, even if you learn just this one method and you applied it for this whole month, right? That's progress in itself. So if we're always like zooming out and trying to like, kind of like that workshop I talked about, like focusing on the 10, like if we're focusing on getting 10 out of 10 all the time, all the time, it's very overwhelming. It's important to keep the goal in mind, the 10. It's also less overwhelming to look at like, what's the next number up? So I'm going from a 3 to a 5 in my life. What's the short-term benefit of that? What's the short-term benefit of me making a little bit of progress or not even needing to know everything? So there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, but we could trust ourselves to make the next step, or we could find out how we can make the next step in our lives. And then eventually when we get good at making these next steps in our lives, we could kind of trust in our own process. We don't have to know everything and be anxious about having a clear, absolute picture of how everything goes on. But we know like we can find our way forward through all of this. So that's my take on it. It's only my take on it too. Anybody else want to share something? Okay. All right. So this next thing. So when thoughts control us. So this diagram is about when thoughts control us, and we either try to fight our thoughts, we try to suppress them, we argue with ourselves, and we kind of bully ourselves for having so-called negative thoughts. And then we try to hide and escape from the thoughts, we try to distract ourselves, we try to zone out or numb our thoughts, right? So there's ways where distracting ourselves could be healthy, right? Because sometimes it's good to like maybe you just play music or to just watch a good TV show, not always try to work on your thoughts all the time, right? But there's times when it's not helpful. So you notice when we're trying to distract ourselves too much from our thoughts, or we're trying to escape from our thoughts all the time, we're trying to push them away. And often that's how alcoholism works, right? So alcoholism is a way that people use alcohol to try to suppress thoughts, negative thoughts that we have. but then you can only keep them at bay for a certain time and then they come back. So ACT therapy very wisely says, it's not always good to try to put those thoughts away. How can you allow ourselves to mindfully be with our thoughts, right? It's not good to kind of be numb. It's not good to be numb to ourselves. And that's when, kind of like Karen was saying, like, it's also important to be sensitive too, to be sensitive and care about the world, and to look at like what's going on in the world and have a lot of compassion for it, right? So we don't want to be too numb. And also there's fighting. We try to suppress our thoughts. We try to argue with ourselves. We bully, like we're harsh on ourselves for having negative thoughts. How dare I have these negative thoughts, right? And then that causes us further suffering. So this is what we do with thoughts. Like, what do we do with thoughts? We fight and we flight from them. Of course, these have some use sometimes. So I was kind of curious, how may you sometimes fight or flight from your thoughts? And either, maybe sometimes it's helpful to dispute your thoughts and sometimes maybe it's helpful to distance yourselves from your thoughts. But I'm kind of curious, like, when you might fight or flight from your thoughts.
It always seems when I'm very anxious, it seems like I'm very critical of myself, especially when the results are negative. It just seems automatically that I'm always very critical.
Yes. Yeah. And this is, yes. Yeah. And I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing, because this is very common. I say, like, most people have some sort of version of this, that they have that inner critic. And I think everyone has an inner critic to some sort of degree that kind of shows up. So by you, Joseph, by you sharing that with everybody else, the great thing about that is that people destigmatize having an inner critical voice, because it's actually a human experience. Anybody else?
Yeah, sometimes I think we accept these thoughts.
Yeah,
and that makes sense. But I guess the problem would be recurrence, wouldn't it?
Like when the thoughts keep coming back, you say?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, the thoughts could come back for sure.
What if you have certain thoughts and you could have anxiety when the thoughts are regarding something you have to do. You might accept the thoughts that you have that you don't want because you need that set of thoughts to go ahead and do what you are intending to do.
Right.
So yeah. So that could cause anxiety. But yeah, I think sometimes you just have to accept them.
Yeah. So like I appreciate what you say, because there's a nuance, right? There's different ways to work with thoughts, right?
Yes.
And yes. And I would like to kind of comment. I think it's very common for people to say too, in general, it's like, I just have to accept. I just have to accept things. And sometimes that causes a bit of an issue, because when we say, I just have to accept things, we start to feel worse in a way, because that statement is naturally kind of unaccepting in itself. So one thing we could tell ourselves is that I prefer to accept. I prefer to accept what's going on. And then when you do that, you take away the expectation of absolutely needing that acceptance. And when that happens, people then they start to feel calmer. They start to naturally have that sense, cultivate that sense of acceptance. So it's good to kind of change it to, I prefer to accept. Again, that's a really great point, though. I'm sorry for being pedantic about the words. Blade Runner.
Yeah, the question was, what was the question again?
The question is like, what are some ways that people might fight or flight from thoughts?
Okay, so I think I engage a lot of flight activities. I either distract myself by, like catching up on shows, like on Netflix or, whatever.
Yes.
Or I will just like not engage in that particular behavior. So social anxiety, I just will choose not to go out. So if I choose not to go out and go see a movie, by myself, or stay home and, watch something, then it's like, okay, so I'm not in that environment that's causing me that kind of stress. So
of course. Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing this, because I think people can identify with this kind of experience. Like, just like Joseph, you're destigmatizing these behaviors. And these are things that people engage in. I engage in these behaviors myself too. So like, so one thing to keep in mind is like, there's times when it is helpful to distract ourselves and to watch TV or to not leave our house, because inside of us, we have an inner manager. So the inner manager within us is trying to get us on task with our goals, on task with our self-improvement. And it's beneficial to us, but then when the manager gets overboard, it could really exhaust us, right? It could really kind of make us feel beaten down. And that's why it could be good to, not always push ourselves. Like, okay, maybe today I'm not going to go, right? Because you want that inner manager to relax too. And sometimes people find that people who their inner manager has been working for a very long time, they could feel very exhausted. So sometimes like people who have a very strong inner manager, they're really exhausted and seem like they're not really getting anywhere with their goals because they're too tired. So actually when they take a break, they find that when they come back to re-engage with their goals, they have a lot more energy with this. So just something to keep in mind. It's like someone who's running, right? If someone's running all the time, they're going to be running very slowly, right? Because they're trying to push themselves, but they don't have energy. So if they take a break, they take a walk, when they run again, they have energy. Anybody else? Fight or flight from thoughts?
I got to insert something here because, and it's going to be personal experience too. I know that sometimes I'm fighting. I know that probably I'm more often in flight. And even the more often in flight exhausts me. So then I can say the word overwhelming. And when I'm overwhelmed, man, I want to stay in bed. And I do sometimes stay in bed 24 hours, which is not, and that in turn, sometimes it feels good in that, yes, I'm getting some rest in some aspects, but otherwise there's a lot of unhappiness and with that.
Yeah, and it could go the other way too. Like sometimes people have a strong inner manager, and then sometimes like at the same time, even with someone with a strong inner manager, there's other times where they may get into flight mode, and then the thing is, the body senses this. So your intuition senses this, and you could tell that the intuition, your body is telling you, oh, something's up right now, right? So it sends a signal and saying, this is not really working well. I bet everyone can identify with this, right? They listen to themselves. And instead of, saying what we're doing is good or bad, that tends to not be as helpful. Just look at things in terms of your body's helping you. The body's sending you a signal and it's helping you out right there. And then we try to adapt and we adjust, right? All right. So let's move on here. So I would like you to think about maybe a thought that kind of reappears for you, something that you might try to fight or flight, but then it keeps coming back, right? Or, if you have trouble thinking about a thought, just think about any sort of thought that kind of pops up. And let's try to work with a thought that is not like overly traumatic for you, because, it's good to kind of work with a thought that is not so intense first as practice. So that's give you some time to kind of think about a thought.
What kind of thought are we looking for?
Just like an unhelpful thought that kind of shows up, that kind of reappears in your life. All right. So Joseph, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I guess a couple of thoughts come to mind. First is that I'm going to miss something that I need for an upcoming engagement or something because I couldn't find it because it wasn't organized. And another thought is that I'm going to if I'm feeling anxious, I'm going to probably miss out on something. I'm going to miss out on an event or something important because I had postponed or procrastinated, and that caused me a consequence from a significant event.
Yeah.
And those are just negative, feelings. It seems like it was, destined to be like a self-fulfilling prophecy when it's not.
Yeah.
Those are
Yeah,
examples.
that must be really overwhelming too, because I hear,
Yeah.
there's like these competing thoughts
Yes,
that
it
are
is.
there.
When I want to change those habits.
Okay, so yeah, we could work with his thoughts. Like, so yeah, keep those thoughts in mind. Anybody else want to share like thoughts? Okay, all right. So take that thought, and you can ask yourself these questions, and ask yourself kindly too. So the key here is to have the sense of self-compassion. When you ask, we often ask ourselves things in a very harsh or critical manner, and when that happens, it kind of exacerbates the kind of pain or suffering around it. So ask yourself these kindly and kind of as a curious scientist. So you're looking at your life. So Russ Harris likes to say this. You're looking at your life as like a curious scientist. How would you, when you ask these questions, how would you reflect upon these questions as a curious scientist? So ask yourself kindly, and you could kind of answer to yourself. Is this an old thought that I have? Like a thought that I have thought of before? Have I heard this thought before? Right? And I'll give you my answers to something about like a thought. And then, yes, I have heard this thought before. And yes, it is an old thought that I have. So do I gain anything useful from listening to it again? So ask yourself that. Do I gain anything useful from listening to it again? And again, don't ask yourself harshly, like, you're not getting anything useful from this. Just say, from yes or no, but like compassionately towards yourself. And I'll say for myself, like, no, I don't find this thought to be helpful that I have right now. Does this thought help me take effective action in improving my life? And for me, that is no, generally no, right? And you can also ask yourself, like what times is it effective, when times it's not? And often the case, it's not effective, right? But maybe sometimes you feel like it's effective. Okay, it's all right to be honest with yourself, but ask yourself generally. Does this thought help me be the person I want to be? So for me, that's no, it does not. Does it help me build the sort of relationships that I like? And again, for me, that's no. Does it help me connect with what I value? No. And does it help me in the long term to create a rich, full, meaningful life? No. So like, and these questions I got from directly from the book. So I really recommend these books, Act Made Simple, and also the other book that I mentioned, the Happiness Trap book. These are very useful questions to ask. There's misunderstandings that we have about thoughts. So we think, first of all, thoughts are reality. So thoughts represent what's happening right now, right? So I have a thought. It's similar to what someone says, like, I have something that I find embarrassing about something in the future that could happen, right? That so when this happens, the reality is that thing is not happening right now, right? So thoughts are not representing the now reality. And first and second of all, think about the newspaper stories too, right? The newspaper stories are presenting a certain kind of angle on looking at the world, and your thoughts are also representing a certain angle. So your thoughts are not literal reality or facts. So another way to look at thoughts is that there's sounds and words and stories in our heads, right? Sometimes, like, for instance, you might have a thought in your head that repeats, that says, I'm a loser, I'm a loser, I'm a loser. And then you're wondering, why do I have this thought? I don't really fully believe that I'm a loser. There's many ways I'm not a loser, right? But the thought, you can't help it, but your mind just keeps repeating these thoughts in your head. So instead of like kind of horrifying ourselves for having a thought, just know that sometimes our mind makes noises. Our mind says things in our head, and it kind of does it automatically, like kind of sneezing, right? Sometimes our minds kind of built a certain kind of habit. I'm not saying the habit doesn't necessarily change over time, but in the meantime, the habit is there, and we don't have to horrify ourselves about our thoughts. Sometimes they're just sounds and there's words that appear in our head. I hope, does that make sense to people? Yeah. So the second one is the thoughts are the truth. That we have to believe in the thoughts. So because, like, I have a thought in my head, I'm a loser. Oh, if I have that thought in my head, that must be the truth, right? But even if you hear that thought, it does not necessarily mean it's true, or that we have to believe in this thought. They may or may not be true, but we do not have to believe in them. They're there. They're sounds, they're words in our heads. Maybe they reflect some sort of truth, but maybe not, right? But I don't have to believe in it. I don't have to say, buy this as absolute truth. Or thoughts are orders. So we must obey our thoughts. So for instance, you might have a thought, like, everyone has this thought, right? After they have a big argument with a relative of theirs, it's like, I want to kill that person, right? I want to show them who's boss. But the fact that we have those thoughts in our heads, it doesn't mean that we need to act on it. Like, no, I don't mean that literally. I don't think people literally want to kill anybody, but like they might want to have revenge, right? But we don't need to obey them. And sometimes we have those thoughts, and just like sneezing, it's natural to have those thoughts, especially when we're angry, right? So we can allow those thoughts to be there, but we don't have to obey those thoughts.
So, may I ask, so you're saying, like, that those thoughts may come into one's head, if you will.
Yes.
But yes, we don't obey them. I can think of, like, say, for example, it's family. For me, I don't so much I might be surprised or saddened or upset, but generally, at one time, what I would want to do would be just get away from the person as much as possible.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
If there isn't any good communication and it's upsetting, and then you go through your mind and, it seems to be valid to be upset.
Yes.
That's as far as I go with it. I've never had that aggressive feeling.
Yes. It's like whenever
someone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you make a good point. Sometimes we need to get away from things, right? Sometimes sometimes it's good to get away from things. And sometimes, like, it's good to take some actions that are helpful for us, right? But not all thoughts that appear in our head that are orders are helpful. So sometimes when we have a thought that says, I want to beat myself up about this, or I have to punish myself for this, right? And even though we have that thought, it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to obey it. So it's really like situational. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not, right? So, like, usually when it comes to self-punishment, it's not helpful. Anybody else? Sade?
I think this is just so interesting because I feel like there's so much truth about what you're saying, that thoughts, you have a thought and it is not necessarily the truth,
Right.
And it's not necessarily reality. But I think it's important to note that repeated thoughts tend to repeated thoughts form beliefs, right? Because like the more you think about something, the more you're kind of starting to believe it, you know? And then that our beliefs translate into, they influence how we operate in the world as a person, you know? And I think, I guess what this whole thing is about too, is kind of like realizing that pattern, you know, so that you know that, okay, now I have the choice though to think a different thought, you know, because a thought it doesn't just become a belief. It becomes a belief after repeated, you know, thinking of it. So yeah, I don't know if that was,
that's an excellent point that you have there. So like, yeah, sometimes like when thoughts get repeated, we start to form a certain kind of believability around it. So this is actually, ACT therapy is actually helpful in addressing that piece. It's saying like, when your thoughts repeat themselves, really your thoughts may influence your beliefs, but your thoughts are not your beliefs, right? So first of all, when often people might mistake their thoughts as their beliefs or reality, or they start to form a belief around their thoughts because they think, well, I'm thinking, I have this repeated thought, so that must be true, or it must have to be that way, right? And that's why they start to believe it. But this is a way of diffusing from the thought. So actually, when you have a repeated belief, but you know that it doesn't have to be true, and because that it's in your head that it must be something you abide by, you start to diffuse from it, and you start to you find it less believable. So ACT therapy is excellent with this because it helps us to find our negative or unhelpful thoughts be less believable.
I've got a question. Is a belief a habit?
Yes. So first of all, okay. So is a belief a habit? So beliefs do come out of habits. So like in CBT, it talks about how we form core beliefs, and that's from ideas that we got that may have been skewed. So from something that we've grown up with, or something we have been influenced by an environment, but our minds filtered and skewed it in some sort of way so that it formed a belief about ourselves. It may come from a habit in how we look at the world. So yes. And this is, with this therapy, it's with ACT therapy, it helps you to diffuse from those beliefs over time.
I have a question. I think you may have just answered it, but since our thoughts, our negative thoughts, aren't reality, where would the thought even originate from?
Yeah, so we have a network in our head, a default network, and sometimes like it could be from upbringing, or some like it could be from a difficult experience that we have. We start to form a thought around it, right? And it might be like a survival mechanism. So often in ACT therapy, they talk about human evolution, and how like before, when we live in caves, for instance, that you know, if you come across something that is potentially threatening, like life threatening, the best thing to do is try to run away or try to fight that thing, right? So that's where that fight and flight comes from, the fight and flight tendencies. In today's world, it's not as helpful. So in the past, it's actually beneficial to have a skewed towards negative belief about the world, right? Because your progeny survive. So the less you take risks and the more you look at things as potential negatives, you avoid negative potentialities. But in today's world, where things are not life or death situations, especially when it comes to our psychology, this tends not to be helpful, because we try to fight and flight from our thoughts. We try to apply this principle, but it can end up making us feel worse. So I hope that answers your question.
if you have low self-esteem, and so people are kind of like picking on you and preying on that, and then realizing that, and this is kind of like a rule of relationships, I guess, that I've read about, is that you can't really change the other person. You can only kind of change yourself and your reaction to something. So realizing that that was like my own internal like feeling, this self-esteem was something I needed to work on. And so kind of starting to tell myself like, all right, I'm building up my self-esteem and I stand up for myself more. And, I'm willing to try voicing how I feel, more. Maybe when I was like not wanting to stand up for myself or say something. And then when I started doing those things, it kind of changed that other person's reaction to me. Like to me, then they start to kind of realize that, I'm like vibrating with a different energy now. So you can't just do that to me, I guess. If that makes sense.
Yes. Really congratulate you on the work that you've done. And you said something really powerful. Like it really does come from an inward transformation. And often when we have that inward transformation, the world around us can start to respond differently, right? Also comes first with that sense of validation, because understandably, like people can treat us rough, right? So it's good to actually validate that experience and not necessarily say, oh, it's all my individual responsibility, because the truth is, people affect us, but they're influencing us. They're not like, they don't have total control over us. They're influencing us. And what you've done that was powerful is that you've took this situation and you made it into an opportunity for personal growth. And so like you've, and I think that's the beauty of the human experience, is that is often through rough experiences that we cultivate ourselves and we turn that into something that's beautiful too. Misunderstandings about thoughts continued. So another one is thoughts are threats, that they're disturbing and we need to get rid of them. So we might have like really difficult thoughts. Like you have a thought that says like, I'm a horrible person, or my kid is horrible, right? Some parents, they feel very guilty about having thoughts about their kids like that. So the important thing to know is that thoughts themselves are not a threat, right? Because we have these thoughts, that is not a terrible, awful thing in itself. Sometimes these thoughts are words that kind of repeat themselves in our heads. And when we try to look at them as disturbing, like these thoughts are disturbing, we're kind of treating the thoughts like they're a symptom of a disease. And when we do that, we start to feel worse about it, right? But when we look at it as, they're thoughts, they're thoughts in my head, and then they're not themselves not a threat, it tends to be better. And thoughts know the best and are wise, simply because we have thoughts in our heads. Again, this goes with the idea of we must obey the thoughts, because in this case is saying we think that those thoughts must know what they're doing. And sometimes we might find something useful in our thoughts, but look at the overall pictures. Sometimes we had to find something useful in those thoughts, right? Because we want to like do well at work, we want to like survive and all that kind of stuff. But also like know that it's more nuanced than that. There's useful elements and there's also unuseful elements. So the thoughts are not always best and wise. So let's do an experiment. So we take that thought you have, like the thought that you've came up with earlier, and I'll give you some time to bring that to mind. And then allow yourself to believe that thought for 20 seconds. So I'll give you 20 seconds to fully believe this thought. Okay, so after this, remind yourself what that thought is again, and say that I am having the thought that. So say that your thought is I'm a loser, right? So now tell yourself I'm having the thought that, and let's stick with this first one. And I'll give you 20 seconds to believe in this thought. Not believe, but like just repeat to yourself again, I'm having the thought that, what your thought is, for 20 seconds. Okay. And then for another 20 seconds, say, I am noticing I'm having the thought that, and what your thought is. So if it's like, I'm a loser, I'm noticing I'm having the thought that I'm a loser. And then for 20 seconds. Okay. So I'll bring you back from this exercise and know that this is an experiment. So like, people do get something from this, but if you're not, then that's okay, right? Then there's also other techniques that you could use. This is not the only one. Not all techniques work with all people. So what do you notice happened, or what's something that you've realized from this exercise or benefited from this exercise? Anybody?
The second sentence is more empowering. It seems like I can prevent that I have more control over controlling the thought than the absolute one, which is the first.
Yes. Yeah. So there's like maybe a sense of a difference of control. Okay. Sade?
In the second experiment, I felt like I was creating distance between myself and the thought. So then I was able to kind of see more clearly, like or objectively. Whereas the first was very overwhelming. It was almost like just taking over my mind, and I couldn't see clearly.
Yes, it's like the first one's like having the hands in front of your face, right? And this one's kind of like you're finding more of the distance over. Yeah. Blade Runner.
Yeah, I also agree with that. Like the experiments where you're saying I am having the thought that, and I am noticing I am having the thought that. Both of those actually, like one creates a certain amount of distance, and the other one creates even more distance. You know, and it makes you more aware that okay, these are thoughts, and then it gives you like power to like deal with those thoughts, as opposed to like if you're unaware that you're having those thoughts, then you may confuse those thoughts with reality, or like with the perception, and then perception becomes reality. Whereas this kind of like says, okay, let's just pump the brakes on your brain and your mind and what it's telling you, and kind of deconstruct it a little.
Yeah, and that's said really well, right? So it's kind of noticing these thoughts are not reality, and it's natural for us to see our thoughts as reality, but when we get distance, we know it's not. You also may see that there's a difference between your observing self and then the thoughts themselves, that we might mistake the thoughts as us, but when we do this exercise, we realize, oh, there's an observer beyond these thoughts. Here's another useful method, is to say to yourself, so you take, sometimes thoughts kind of come in packages, right? So there's related thoughts, and then they kind of repeat themselves, and they kind of form a certain kind of story, like a newspaper article. So maybe you have thoughts like, I can't do this right. I can do nothing right. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And these thoughts kind of go together, and they form the I am a failure story, right? So sometimes it helps to put a label on it. So think about like, what story is your thoughts consist of? So if your thoughts like made up a book, what would you name it as a title? And come up with a title that is not invalidating. Like, this is the you suck story, right? Come up with something that's kind of not invalidating for you. And the idea here is that when you put a label on it, so you notice that you have these thoughts and they're returning, and it's like, these thoughts are familiar. I recognize these thoughts. And then you put a label, it's like, oh, this is the I'm a failure story, right? So there's a way to label it, and then you could give yourself distance from that story as a whole. So instead of like working with all these individual thoughts, like it's helpful to do that previous exercise of I'm having a thought that I advise that like during the course of the week, you could try that. Here, like when there's a lot of thoughts, which is common, you put that together in a story, say, oh, here's the I'm a failure story. And I find this to be useful for myself. So like there was like a story that was in my head and I put a label to it. And each time the story showed up, I was faster at putting the label to it. And then I became better at distancing myself from that story. It's kind of a way to simplify it. I did want to say something about the last exercise before I forget, is that the reason why I have you believe the thought for 20 seconds in the beginning is like, why would you want to believe in this thought for 20 seconds? Is a way to destigmatize yourself from it. So sometimes we try to avoid thoughts at all costs because we think if I believe this thought at all, it's going to be a horrible thing. So the idea here is to destigmatize it and say, like, you could believe this thought and it's not necessarily going to be horrible, right? And I could still distance myself from the thought. So let's go back here. So again, it's like looking at life like a videotape. We don't avoid or get rid of the story. We acknowledge the story. We acknowledge that the story is there. And something that may be helpful is to say to yourself, thank you, mind. How informative and interesting, and say it with warmth and gentle humor. Like in a way that is very kind to yourself. And it works. Like, try this out. Like if your mind says something negative, say, thank you, mind. That's informative and interesting. Sometimes when you fight or dispute your mind, it gets louder. It's kind of like someone sitting next to you and kind of nudging and prodding you. And then you argue back at that person, and that person argues back at you. And you know that only creates more and more tension, right? So if you do something a bit ironic here and say, thank you so much for that thought, like the person calms down. And the same thing with our mind kind of calms down when that happens, right? And here's the final thing, caveats. So I just want to put things into perspectives here. Thoughts come and go, so don't expect to completely let them go, right? It's not like you're absolutely going to get this perfect all the time. I'm going to completely distance myself from my thoughts. Sometimes you're going to do well, sometimes it'll be hard, and it's okay. So you try these exercises, I'm having the thought, that exercise, and the story exercise, and there's times you're going to do it and sometimes you're not, and that's going to be okay. Things take practice over time, right? You're not going to be perfect. So the second one, feeling good is a byproduct and not the aim. So the goal is to disentangle from our thoughts. So often people feel better when they do these exercises, when they diffuse from their thoughts, but when they make that into an expectation, that's not as helpful. So the goal is to disentangle from our thoughts. And the last one here is that we could forget to use these skills, and it's okay. We're human beings. We're all humans, and that's perfectly natural. We're all fallible human beings. So come back and practice again, right? Just like with other things in life. So often psychology is a lot like any habit that you're building, and people don't realize that because psychology is in here. But like when we work on things, we know like it takes time, it takes skill, and we're going to do well some points. Sometimes we don't do well. If you play a sport, you are familiar with this. Sometimes we have our bad days, right? That's perfectly natural. All right, so let's end this.